Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here at the 21st Congress, Humanitarian Congress, with an emphasis on impacts of climate change. It's a pleasure to host you here in these rooms and also in Berlin. Before I say some words about the content, I want to especially thank everybody who made this Congress possible. This is mainly the committee of the German Red Cross, the Médecins du Monde, the Médecins Sans Frontières, and the Berlin Chamber of Physicians. And for this event, we have as a partner Greenpeace, so welcome also Greenpeace, especially Jennifer Morgan, who will take the floor after me. And this Congress was founded in 1997, so it's meanwhile a quite old Congress, and it's also, to our pleasure, one of the biggest congresses on this topic in the world, and it would not be possible without the organizers, the committee, it would not be possible without the speakers, the participants, and of course the supporters. And a special thanks to Nora Detmer, who is heart and brain of the organizational work. So Nora, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change will not disappear automatically. So we can't just sit and wait. It will stay, and we have to do something. And climate change normally is perceived as a threat, but also as a challenge. And a challenge in many dimensions. It's a humanitarian challenge, it's a medical challenge, it is a social challenge, and of course also a political challenge. And climate change normally promotes a lot of fear and anger on both sides of the streets. The ones who are demonstrating to do something and the other ones who say, leave me alone, so climate change is a fake, it's not true. And I want to promote something that I've learned yesterday by Carol, thank you very much, who mentioned an article in The Lancet. Why can't we take climate change as a chance and an opportunity to think and learn about how we want to live on this planet, how we want to live together, what kind of marvelous technological changes might happen to all of us if you do it right? Why can't we put climate change in a positive frame? When we put it in a positive frame, this will promote acceptance. And if we promote acceptance, of course, there will be more combined actions, including industry and politicians, the two key groups we need on board. So I hope that this Congress will play an important part in this reframing climate change with providing solutions and bringing all you together. And you use the opportunity not only to learn, but to discuss and make some new friends and networks. Third, housekeeping. I was told to tell something about housekeeping. So catering will be on the first floor and on the ground floor. The reception will take part in the ground floor, and with Peter Tinnemann, I just discussed the idea whether we should organize for the next time a party, not instead of a reception, but you are all young enough in an age that you will not spend your evenings in front of the television. And Berlin is the party location #1, so maybe we will have also an opportunity for joy and laughter. There's a wonderful exhibition on action, humanitarian action on the first and second floor. And there is also an online audience, and it's streamed live, everything what happened here in the first floor. And please take an active part on Facebook and Twitter with hashtag HCBerlin. You will already find lots of comments on Twitter about this wonderful Congress. The volunteers are here to answer your questions. Thank you very much to the volunteers. And please turn your mobile phones silent. What you should not turn silent is your hearts and your voices. So please keep your hearts beating and burning and keep your minds clear. A clear mind provides the right action at the right time. The burning heart gives you the energy, and the brains might give you the right direction to do the right things right, to really take the right action in climate change. And of course, this will also promote the success of all what you are doing. And now I'm inviting the Jennifer Morgan, the Executive Director of Greenpeace, and the Chair of the opening session, Caroline Voute from Holland, from the Médecins Sans Frontières, on the floor. And I wish you all a wonderful Congress. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this opening conversation about the humanitarian impacts of climate change. It's great to have so many of you that are able to join us both in person and online. And as we go along, I encourage participants in the room as well as online to comment on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag HCBerlin. A big thank you to our organizers, most of whom have already been cited, but particularly for organizing this humanitarian conference every year. And this year, thank you for organizing it with a focus on the humanitarian impacts of climate change, a reality that is and will test the extremes of our understanding of the humanitarian imperative. This is to provide assistance wherever it's needed and to alleviate human suffering amongst those least able to withstand the stresses caused by humanitarian crises, and in this case, the climate crisis. I am joined here today by Jennifer Morgan, the Executive Director of Greenpeace International, who will shortly be giving her outlook on this theme from the perspective of an experienced climate activist. However, before she joins us, I thought I would take the opportunity to share some reflections from the perspective of a few humanitarians that are endeavoring to work between these two issues to help us frame the session. Climate change is rapidly accelerating, and we are feeling the effects of it ever more. It's well documented, it's acute, and linked to significant increases in ill health and humanitarian needs. The science shows us that the following realities are on the horizon for us all: increased extreme weather events, population growth, adding almost 2 million people by 2050. Many of these people will live in urban areas. 68% of the world population will live in cities or megacities by 2050. Food and water scarcity will increase. This will exacerbate undernutrition and waterborne diseases. Patterns of disease will shift via changes in the spread, as well as life cycles of vectors, their reservoirs, and pathogens. An estimated 250 million people will be forced to their homes by 2050. The frequency of collective violence will likely increase, worsening instability in vulnerable regions and catalyzing conflict, and mental health of affected populations will deteriorate. Overall, we know that the health and socioeconomic inequalities that exist will exacerbate. In fact, the climate crisis is already challenging global health systems and escalating humanitarian crises. Some populations will be able to adjust to this new environmental condition, but many will require humanitarian assistance to survive, with demands in excess of the response capacities of both national governments and humanitarian actors. Now, given this, I would like to say that the way forward is clear for all of us. But the truth is that, much like the wider world, today we stand at a crossroads. We're not questioning the science of the changing climate, but questioning our purpose and place in this fight. Terms such as planetary health, mitigation, adaptation, and environmental degradation can sometimes trigger a bit of a disconnect for many of us as we read through the reports of the IPCC. They can be distant from the everyday realities of running a mobile clinic, of distributing shelter kits and mosquito nets, or of conducting a vaccination campaign. Conceptually, climate change seems much larger than the work of humanitarian organizations. It therefore may be hard to understand practically what role we should play when faced with planet-level catastrophe. However, we can't deny that there is significant overlap between populations served by humanitarian action and those most vulnerable to the effects of the climate crisis. Health and humanitarian actors, local, national, and international, are fundamental to reducing negative impacts on vulnerable populations. In today's climate of anti-solidarity and national isolationism, we know if we don't engage with global governments and actors on behalf of those most affected, it seems highly unlikely that anyone will, and their suffering will slip through the cracks. Some of the organizations in this room or online integrated climate realities into their humanitarian action more than a decade ago. Some have been carrying out emergency responses that we know were driven directly or indirectly by climate, but we can't see clearly where to go from there. And some are still having heated debates internally about whether this is our role. At the risk of distracting us from our fundamental mandates, and because maybe we don't really have the expertise. Working between these two arenas, we can struggle with credibility. Many of us are deeply concerned with climate issues, but we're not climate scientists. We are doctors, nurses, epidemiologists, logisticians, water and sanitation experts, HR and finance coordinators, project coordinators. We can build and run a hospital in a week, or set up a water distribution system for 100,000 people in a refugee camp. But we may feel that we lack the knowledge in this. We worry about the attribution science. Humanitarians intervene at the end of the equation. We address the emergency as it unfolds, and we have difficulty scientifically pointing to the root causes of displacement or ill health. Yet maybe we shouldn't get so caught up in linear thinking. If we take examples such as Yemen, where conflict has affected the country so deeply that malnutrition and cholera are rife, can we say that the conflict caused these epidemics? No. However, we can say that Yemen would likely not be experiencing the scale of the problem that is facing now if there was peace. No matter what stage each of us are at organizationally, it's not too late. And the very least, we have the obligation to do some of the following. Commit to examining and reducing our organization's carbon and environmental footprint. Where we can and feel credible, engage in advocacy to safeguard the health and well-being of people most at risk. Include climate realities in our analyses and adapt the life cycle of our programming from risk reduction to assessment to response. However, the most important message, and probably that of this conference, is that we don't have to do this alone. Humanitarians have to consciously explore functional links and knowledge exchange with global climate centers and networks, whose experience and insights augment and complement our own. With this in mind, it's my pleasure to tell you a bit about Jennifer Morgan, a leading expert on climate issues and civil society advocacy. She was recently voted by Apolitical as one of the world's top 20 most influential people in climate policy. Morgan is currently the executive director of Greenpeace International. She was involved in climate issues for over 20 years and has held a series of directorship roles in climate programs at different non-governmental organizations, including World Resources Institute, E3G, and WWF. She has participated in every COP meeting since the first in Berlin in 1995. Yeah, I thought I would pause on that one. Jennifer was also review editor for the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and has served on the advisory board for the Grantham Institute on Climate and the Environment. Previously, she served on the German Council on Sustainable Development and was a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. At German Watch's 20th anniversary celebration, Jennifer was named an honorary member of the organization for her long-term commitment to international climate issues and the empowerment of civil society. With all of this in mind, please join me in welcoming her.
Wow, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm incredibly excited to be here, and I'd much rather be here than at one of those COPs. They're kind of, you get your battle guard on when you go into one of those things, and they're necessary, but they're hard work. And so I yeah, you've heard a little bit about me, and it's a honor to be asked to speak to all of you today, and I'm very grateful to the steering committee, to Médecins Sans Frontières, to Médecins du Monde, the Deutsche Rotes Kreuz, and the Ärztekammer Berlin for this invitation to be here and to share some thoughts with you at this Humanitarian Congress. And what a fantastic group of people to see here. And I look forward to learning today, throughout the day, from you all as well. I feel a lot personally of great admiration and respect for the work that you all do around the world, that the work that you are engaged in humanitarian aid, and you are quick to come to the aid of people in need, and often in dangerous and challenging places. And though the work may seem different to you as far as what Greenpeace might do and what you might do, I think we actually have quite a lot in common. That we all share a very deep concern and care for our planet and for the fellow human beings that are on it. A set of shared values that unites us, I think. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing in the world today. We've had the great privilege of supporting humanitarian operations on several occasions. Back in 2015, for example, Greenpeace and MSF ran a joint relief operation off the coast of Lesbos, and it was both a remarkable and I must say a very humbling shared experience that I know remains a great source of pride for many of the Greenpeace staff that participated in it, and very much an inspiration to the rest of us. And I just want to say right here and now and into the future, we remain very committed to work with you, to help however we can, and we're very and enormously proud of our longstanding relationship with MSF based on friendship and on mutual respect. And it's for those reasons and many, many more that I'm really delighted to be here and to get this invitation. And for me and for others, I think the humanitarian organizations and the health organizations in the room coming together for this event, you're known for your unfaltering courage and your deep determination to act in the best interests of people in need of help worldwide. And so I have no doubt that it's that courage and that's that care right now that's leading you to step forward and really consider what are these links? How can we work the links between climate change and humanitarian impacts? And how can you engage at this moment in history? And to be honest, I really wish I didn't have to be here. I really wish that over all the years that we would have dealt with this better, that we wouldn't be in a climate emergency, that we would have all the science, all the climate activists, all that work would have gotten us to a different situation than we are today, and that I didn't need to stand here and tell you and engage with you on all of this. But unfortunately, as you know, that's not the case. We're now in a situation that every year that goes by without adequate climate action determines literally the life and death of people around the world. And so this is a profoundly important moment in history of our world. I say that, it sounds very big, but I feel that very deeply. It's one that's testing our very humanity. And if we act now with boldness and with that courage and with integrity, we still have time to save many, many millions of lives and to preserve a level of stability for young people today and for generations to come. But if we don't, and I don't like to think about that, and that's why we're here today, to avoid that. But if we don't, we are just staring in the face a level of catastrophe humankind has never experienced, because the climate crisis is both an ecological and a humanitarian emergency. And this is especially true, as you know, for marginalized and vulnerable communities who have to be at the center of what we're doing. It has to be at the center for how we fix this crisis, because they're going to suffer the most, and that's one of the most unjust things I think that is around in the world today. These impacts of climate change, they are unevenly weighted against the poorest people, the most exposed, and those with the least resources to withstand these climate shocks and stresses. Climate change is a threat multiplier. It's going to exacerbate, it already is exacerbating existing problems in regions already prone to conflict, instability, food and water shortages, disease, and persistent poverty. Most unjust of all is indeed that those that have contributed the least are feeling the impacts the hardest, and that is documented and experienced all around. So we all have to work together to protect them and to avoid something that is just unfathomable. Because climate change is leading to disasters that are more unpredictable and they're more complex. It increases the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events, which in turn drives displacement and migration. Supercharged storms, long-lasting floods, more frequent drought, and searing heat waves are already intensifying food insecurity, resource-related conflict, and displacement. Climate experts, the IPCC, others have documented. 28 million people were displaced in 2018, and over half of them because of extreme weather events. That's 16.1 million people forced out of their homes last year as a result of this exacerbation of climate change. And now there's an overwhelming number of reports and studies warning us of these risks of inaction. I wanted to draw your attention. You've probably already read it, but I just found it really excellent. The one that's recently been published by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, which came out the day before the worldwide strikes in September. It was called The Cost of Doing Nothing, and it's subtitled The Humanitarian Price of Climate Change. And it detailed the organization's vision on how the worst effects could be avoided. That's what I will come to that. That report, though, to kind of put this all in the room, it estimates that some 200 million people will need humanitarian aid by 2050 due to climate-linked disasters. And what that means for your organizations, I think, must be heart palpitating. That's almost double current figures, and also it found that the cost of responding to these emergencies could reach $20 billion a year. Other reports point out that weather-related events account for more than 87% of the total 265 million new displacements associated with disasters globally between 2008 and 2012. And if you start looking at desertification, well, the livelihoods of nearly 1 billion people in some 100 countries are threatened by desertification, with about 12 million hectares worldwide lost to land degradation. These numbers are just staggering, I know, and I think it's often too hard, as you were saying, to try and understand what this actually means. But I actually think that this audience and the work that you do on the ground, you probably have a better understanding of what this could mean because of the work that you do closely to so many people and the closeness you have to these impacts. We know that climate change is also affecting the social and environmental determinants of health, so clean air, safe drinking water, sufficient food and water shelter. The direct damage costs to health, so excluding costs in health-determining sectors such as agriculture and water and sanitation, is estimated to be between $2.2 to $4 billion every year by 2030. So areas, obviously, with a weak health infrastructure, mostly those places in developing countries, are going to be the least able to cope, right? Without the assistance to be able to prepare, and preparing is important, and responding. The World Health Organization estimates that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. And a November 2018 joint report by Lancet and MSF warns that trends in climate impacts, exposures, and vulnerabilities demonstrate an unacceptably high level of risk for the current and future health of populations across the world, again, increasing the risk of new widespread humanitarian crises. Also, climate change impacts internationally guaranteed human rights, including the right to life, the right to water, sanitation, food, health, housing, self-determination, culture, and development. These facts can really totally paralyze us. But we need to move forward. And I think that we can't be paralyzed. We actually have to go into action. We have to look at everything from the integration of these facts into our day-to-day planning and practice to engaging with family and friends and colleagues and having those challenging conversations, yes, indeed, also with governments and with companies. The world needs the knowledge and expertise that you have in the field, the experience and the legitimacy that you have in your sector to collaborate in the face of this challenge. Your voices matter tremendously in many, many corners of the world. And so this is a profoundly important moment in the climate fight because the world is starting to shake and move. And that's what gives me hope, and that's what we want to work together on. I think we are at the beginning of something that is only going to gather momentum. In September 20th, I was marching in New York, just one of more than 7 million people around the world. I don't know if you watched it, but as I got up, it had started in the Pacific, what made its way all around the world, all the way out to Vancouver. There were over 6,000 actions in 185 countries on all 7 continents. I'm sure some of you were out there as well. And it was likely the largest mass protest on climate change we've ever seen. And it was led by youth, as you know. But people all around the world participated in it, and they made it clear that they will no longer accept the apathy, the excuses of inaction from weak political leaders that are incapable of standing up to the powerful fossil fuel and other industries. And that's a power that has to be curbed if we're going to effectively reduce emissions in time. So something of this scale requires a response at equal scale. We can't just think incrementally anymore. And it's an understatement, I think, to say that our political and economic systems around the world, they are failing people and the planet. So this requires radical collaboration. And I think it'd be great to explore over the next 2 days, what does that look like? That radical collaboration amongst us to support each other, to learn from each other, and to respect the role that each of us play at this moment in history. It also requires a new level of leadership around the world. For example, there should be a new foreign and security policy that treats this as a crisis and prioritizes international collaboration around known solutions, provides the humanitarian support for those impacted, and engages in national debates in a meaningful way to bring the international risks and opportunities to the fore. There should be a sense that we have to build the new electricity system based on efficiency and renewable energy that's available and affordable to everyone, which means we do need to phase out coal here early and no new coal after 2020. It would mean creating a financial system. Think about what our financial system is currently funding. It shouldn't invest in fossil fuel and deforestation, but rather in the solutions to this problem. So we can't afford another global economic crisis and a financial crisis. And this time the banks know, don't they? They know the risks that are out there. So we need governments to hold them accountable. And it would also mean that we would have a food and farming system that prioritizes eco-farming, ends deforestation, not only one that prioritizes industrial agriculture and where those companies benefit. And so for each of those, if you think about the scale of it, we need a transition and a just transition for particularly the workers who are there in all countries around the world. But for each of those, there are huge interests trying to stop this transition. And so for that reason, we all need to work immediately and urgently to accelerate both adaptation and mitigation. If we cut emissions in half by 2030, we can restrict warming to 1.5 degrees. There is no other way. And we are up against the most powerful political and industrial forces that would prefer us to stay working in our silos. We do this, you do that, we do this. But that's not what we're going to do. Because if we're going to achieve the long-lasting, sustainable, fair transition, we need everyone. And I think for too long, NGOs, Greenpeace included, we've been operating in our silos. And now we are entering into a decisive decade where the impacts of our changing climate are going to be incredibly devastating and far-reaching, and our work has to move beyond our traditional scopes and be truly transformational. That's uncomfortable, but that's where we are. Last month in New York, and this is a picture from that, it was one of the highlights for me was when a global group got together. It was made up of representatives from organizers, Greenpeace, Amnesty International, and the UN Human Rights Office, as well as participants from indigenous groups, impacted areas, and other organizations, including MSF. It was a People's Summit for Human Rights and Climate Change. It adopted a landmark declaration calling on governments and corporations to urgently tackle the climate emergency. I recommend checking that out. 400 organizations have signed on to that declaration. And so, yes, the change is here, it's coming, and we need to find ways of radically collaborating. I think one area where Greenpeace can help, perhaps, is by sharing our expertise with you with where we see these iconic battlegrounds happening, but also connections into climate scientists. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to build huge climate divisions in your organizations. We can help connect you to the science so that you can also be informed and be able to work smartly. And of course, I know that you or your organizations are not Greenpeace. You are not campaigning organizations. You can bet, and I'm sure you'll know, that we're going to keep on working as we do in an activist way. But I wanted to just share with you 5 things that I would request you consider in your work on climate change. The first is to really integrate the scenarios of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and I hate to even mention this, but even 4 degrees into your own planning. It's going to tell you what you're likely going to need to respond to and prepare for and focus on in years to come. There's lots of work out there that's been done on this that you could then look at. The second is to raise awareness about the people suffering and dying from climate change impacts. Help people connect the dots for us. Because, and that's when the attribution science, of course, is clear. But connecting the dots between a crisis on the ground or a health issue and climate change is key. The media doesn't always do this, right? And so people are left not understanding how things are connected, nor imagine connecting that event into the fact that there's burning of fossil fuels and deforestation that causes it. That's a big leap for people. So helping connect those dots. Third, when talking about the root causes of humanitarian crises, when appropriate, include climate change and its drivers as one of the fundamental issues to address. Fourth, build resilience in the long term. So whether that be through adaptation measures to reduce the risks, or through building renewable and efficient infrastructure afterwards, which will also be more sustainable to those impacts that come. And fifth and last, engage in whatever way that you can in key societal, economic, and political debates. Right now, we just don't have enough voices and power to shift these decisions in the right trajectory. Governments have not yet responded with the scale and the speed required. And one of the reasons why I think that's the case is because they're prioritizing one set of voices in societies that are way more short-termism and looking at profit over the well-being of their own citizens and other people and nature around the world. We together, I think, can shift that. I have seen it happen, that sense of inevitability when people come together to create change. But we can find all ways, in our own voices, to question things, to bring ourselves into those decisions. And as I said, this may be sometimes uncomfortable, and it does take a fair amount of courage, but it's frankly what we need right now. We've lost a lot of time, and as I said, I wish I weren't here, but now I think with that kind of courage, we can really move with it, and we can't just assume the governments are going to read the science and respond. It's pretty clear they're not. So we each need to think differently. I love the thought of an open heart and an open mind of how we work together. And we know that if countries do fail to limit those rising global temperatures, the report from the Red Cross estimates that number of people caught in these humanitarian crises fueled by climate change will nearly double, and an inaction that could cost billions in humanitarian responses. So we have no choice. So let's go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was straightforward and inspiring. Thank you. I actually get the privilege of having first crack at you for questions, after which point we have a few volunteers who will help circulate microphones in the audience for your own questions as well as those of you that are online. Because humanitarians are a practical community, yeah. In the event that we haven't read all the way through the IPCC report or had difficulties understanding all of the nuance in it, would you be able to simplify for us the best and worst case scenarios of the 1.5, 2, 3, or 4 degree warming? And are there already areas that for you should be a focus for health and humanitarian actors?
I'll do my best. So I think, actually, I'll just put a plug in for just the summary for policymakers report of the 1.5 study that came out last October. It's pretty short, it's pretty clear, so if you're crunched on time, I think that's a good one to look at. But I think, best to worst, so we're currently at about 1.1 degrees over pre-industrial levels, and you're seeing what's happening in the world right now, right? So you're seeing the types of, the droughts that are occurring, you're seeing the extreme intensification of hurricanes. It's more around the intensity of hurricanes rather than the frequency of hurricanes. That's something to be aware of. And I think the best scenario is that we kind of stay there, and actually probably a little bit worse than that, because greenhouse gas emissions stay in the atmosphere a long time. Depends on which gas you're talking about. There's 7 of them. Some of them stay in the atmosphere a very long time, which means that it will take time to bring temperatures back down to the safe levels. So I think in the best case scenario, you're looking at an intensification of those types of impacts. So, and I think in developed countries, I just take Germany as an example, and the drought that occurred where the government could afford to actually help farmers here in Germany, but it was billions, right? You're looking at that across the world, and particularly Horn of Africa and many of the vulnerable places. When you start going up from there and temperature increases, and if you can imagine yourself sitting in the South Pacific or in the Caribbean, and people who live there, the sea level rise numbers start to increase. And the thing that actually keeps me more up at night than the IPCC is a study called Hothouse Earth. Hothouse Earth, which came out from the Potsdam Institute and others, basically helps us understand that there are points in time that the impacts become irreversible. Because I think we always think, okay, well, it's like air pollution. You can put a scrubber on the smokestack and then it'll go down and we'll stop the air pollution. But there are the potential for tipping points where the melting of Greenland ice shelf or of the West Antarctic ice shelf is unstoppable. And that's when you get in these very scary projections where if you're up into a space where humankind has never been there before, you have cities that are unlivable, not only in developing countries, the east coast of the United States with 7-meter sea level rise. Florida will be gone long before then. So you're looking at a world where national boundaries don't really matter anymore because there's so much movement because of these different events. You're looking at a food production actual crisis. You're looking at fisheries collapsing. We're already with coral reefs at a level with 1.5, where you see potential complete loss of coral reefs. And I think, and then I'll stop, because it is a dark place that we don't want to go. That's why we're all here. But I think the worrying thing is that it also could create even more division in societies. Because I think we all are already seeing that when impacts are coming from the outside, everybody kind of hunkers down to take care of their own. And I worry about the political implications of that and how I think that could become even worse than we're seeing today. So that's why we need to stay on that lower end. I think the areas that should be a focus, I mean, I think already in the work that you do, there are all kinds of resources on looking at how to adapt, whether it be the houses that are being built, whether it be the early warning systems that have started to be set up. That makes a huge difference. You see across the world in places like Bangladesh or other places where there's been an early warning system that people can be evacuated at least. I think looking at and I think those are the places where I would kind of focus in, is on the infrastructure of places and those warning systems. That's where I would start.
Great. Thank you very much. Actually, on that, part of the subjects of discussion in the humanitarian world right now is who should be doing what. We've got local civil society organizations, we've got national actors, ministries of health, and we've got transnational or international actors. In your experience, are there any particularly good examples from the world of climate activists that we should consider in how we, not divide and conquer, but how we work cohesively on this? Because obviously what we don't want is to say, okay, all the international NGOs send people over there because that's counters of the problem.
I think, yeah, if I were trying to think practically again, I think there's some things that you could just collectively source. So on the science side of things and the attribution science and that type of thing, we, for example, Greenpeace is working with the scientific community and with others like the International Trade Union Congress, so that when an emergency hits, we're able to very quickly say, can you attribute this to climate change or not? And how to talk about it. We have a science unit and we work with some of the top climate scientists. So that's like a network that already exists that I think could be tapped into some of the organizations here. I think also because we do need everyone in the public debate right now, I think I would say everybody should be communicating about those connecting of the dots and optimally of what needs to happen and however they can do it, and the role of different players in doing that. And I think, again, that's something where an organization like us or some of our partners who are on the ground and know those debates could help just give you the information to say, okay, what is the latest on the renewables law and whatever, right? So those networks like the Climate Action Network or others, that all exists. You don't need to reinvent that type of thing.
I think that's a very key message, because when we bring the issue of climate change to most humanitarian organizations, indeed most health organizations, the perspective is, oh my God, that's huge. We can't take that on, and if we do, then it requires a change of our entire system and structure. And it's very key that you've highlighted that for us, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. In MSF, we like to say you just need to slide a climate lens onto your operations. So it's really about doing what you are good at doing, but tailoring them a little bit more to climate realities.
Indeed, I think if you work in the Horn of Africa and you look at some of the scenarios, then look at you can see what the different crops are likely to be. You can all that research is out there so that then you can put your lens on as what that means of how you practically engage on the ground, definitely.
Switching a little bit to discussions on policy and maybe kind of gaps that people are falling through. You mentioned the possibility of creating a foreign and security policy that treats the climate crisis as, and prioritizes international collaboration around known solutions and provides humanitarian support for those impacted. I guess at least from my own experience, there are two scenarios that jump to mind. One is the Horn of Africa, where we watched over the progress of 2 years populations, nomadic populations in particular, lose their livelihoods and be reduced into internally displaced camps where they were dependent on food assistance or humanitarian assistance. And then thinking also obviously about Bangladesh and the number of people that have been that have sought alternative livelihoods in urban structures because they can no longer pursue what they did before. Now these are national governments need to take responsibility for these populations, but there is no, I'm not aware that there is a precedent or that there is any kind of policy that supports people whose livelihoods have been taken away from them and who essentially have been pushed out of what they know. It's a roundabout question, but...
Yeah, I mean, I think, no, I don't know of anything like that. The only thing that comes to my mind is the law of the sea for island populations, right? What happens when the island disappears? Who owns the resources under the sea, and where do those people go? But there is no, it's a gap in international law. The one area where governments are currently debating, you know, there is the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is coming into an incredibly important phase because the heart of that agreement was a long-term goal that says we have to get to zero emissions and a ratchet mechanism so that every 5 years countries have to increase their commitments. And that year is coming up, it's next year. And within the Paris Agreement is also something called a loss and damage mechanism. And that is about who pays for the losses and the damages, right, of particularly countries and peoples who don't have infrastructure or GDPs like OECD countries do. And as you can imagine, it is a huge debate where developed countries are trying at every turn to try and avoid any language that might be holding them liable for the costs of those loss and damages. And islands and vulnerable countries are working very hard to try and move that forward. And I think that's a space to watch and to engage in, and I think this community would have a lot of examples, I am sure. I mean, that's the other thing that I think you all can help us do is the storytelling. I don't get to meet people every day that are in the midst of all of this crisis. You do. And I think those stories are incredibly important, but then bringing back things to them. So it's a gap. I think some of the gaps are being filled by litigation. There's over 1,000 climate cases around the world today, even one here in Germany with some local farmers working to sue the federal government for lack of action. So you see other things coming in, and that's where I see more leadership right now than on the government level.
Any way we can go.
Absolutely.
I'm going to get in one more question and then hand over to the audience. I think if we're going to be here talking about this, then we have to talk about the fact that both the health industry and humanitarian action is, it doesn't come without a footprint. And one of the most important principles for healthcare practitioners is that of do no harm. So are there areas of focus that you would recommend for those of us looking to really take action and mitigate our environmental or carbon footprint?
Your own footprint, yeah. Absolutely. So, and that's another area we do quite a lot there, as you can imagine, and others do as well. The World Resources Institute has a whole protocol on this, so you can look at it. But I think it's pretty straightforward. You know, first look at your buildings, see how efficient they are, see if you can put solar panels on your roofs or buy green electricity if you can. The biggest footprint, I'm sure, oftentimes is the flying. So trying to have a good VC system, investing in that, trying it out. There's all kinds of way of having good meetings, even if you can't touch each other, and really prioritizing when you need to go places. Obviously, you all need to go places and be places, but if you can do things that way, I think that's quite important. Looking at the installations that you're building, that's the thing that I think could be quite, many places where you work, the sun is very strong, so looking at how you can actually be installing solar and building infrastructures that are very efficient and robust. Think about a storm coming through and what standard a building has on that. And another is, your own fleet. So we look at it because we have ships, but really working to move any cars or vehicles away from fossil into electric where it's possible, powered by renewable energy. And last but not least is to look at your food policy. And this is often one that is some of the most hotly debated in 2 organizations I've now worked in. But I think if you know the fact that meat actually causes about the same emissions as cars and trucks around the world, then having less and better meat and dairy in your cafeterias, in your travel policy, in your events, is also something that's really important, and I don't think has been as high up as kind of what cars you drive, how much you fly. What you eat, what you serve, obviously it needs to be, it's different in different cultures, we get that, but less and better meat and dairy.
Good copy, and I saw that the Congress had got that message as well, so. Thanks so much. At the risk of calling out Nora, maybe it's time to hand over for questions from the audience to allow people to express their thoughts as well.
And ideas for me
Yep.
to take with me, please. I'm all ears, too.
There are 2 lovely ladies who are in charge of the microphones. There they are. Great.
Oops. My name is Thea Hilhorst. I just wanted to say that it would be so great if we can link the climate change agenda, humanitarianism as well, to some of the ongoing projects in humanitarianism, which is particular localization. The more that is done locally, the less we need to fly around the world. And secondly, the notion of prevention, to have disaster risk reduction and not just run after the disasters. Similarly, it's a bit sensitive to humanitarians, but working more on conflict prevention will also do a lot to do no harm in terms of the climate damage that is done by conflict.
Absolutely. I think localization, thank you for raising that, because I think particularly in kind of almost in everything in a way, but particularly if you look in the agricultural field and the localization that can be happening there, I think that's a key piece as well. And prevention, I think there is enough information out there to have a good sense of what's coming. And anybody who's not kind of integrating this in, I think, is a bit in denial. So integrating in and looking at those impacts that are likely to come on those scenarios, but also just already, and thinking about those preventative measures, I think is key. And you asked before just about, because I think you're an interesting, important audience on public budgets. Mm-hmm. So what are health ministries investing in right now? The prevention thing comes in there. What are development ministries? How are they integrating climate into what they're doing from an adaptation perspective, which also gets into the prevention side of things. So also engaging, I think, on that side of things. And conflict prevention, I think, if you think about that question you're saying about well, if foreign policy and security communities were to put this at the center, it's not rocket science. You can see where these things are going to come together. So you would have a number of countries optimally who would be already getting ready for what's coming, having the resources ready, putting them aside so that when it happens, you're not looking for funds. The funds are already there. And yeah, I think that would also come to me, and getting all of those actors to be more in the prevention mindset.
In complement to that, I would say one of the debates that we're having at MSF is about mapping vulnerabilities, because the more you are aware of the vulnerabilities and what will play in where, the more you can tailor your operations and respond better, have better emergency preparedness stocks and trainings, get there faster. It's one of the things that I think we all struggle with, because we often tend to respond to emergencies in silos. So, the Horn of Africa, people responded to the drought, then responded to measles, then responded to malnutrition, and we didn't link all of that up, and we didn't really find the way forward for identifying a slow onset degradation of people's well-being. So I think that's something that's probably key for all of us in being more prepared and reducing suffering.
Yeah, and the other thing, maybe on the ground, I mean, what I'm noticing is a number of organizations are now much more engaged. From, I was talking to Plan International, right? Girls and women's rights. They are totally now working on climate change, because if you look at the most vulnerable, well, they need to be more engaged. Or, I know Oxfam is here, and Oxfam, as a development organization. So I think if you, my dream scenario would be that you would have networks on the ground that are connected. We use that in the Arab Spring, we can use that in this type of thing as well, right? That can actually connect and share information across those networks, and then see, okay, who can be stepping in where. I think we have to think much more in this kind of cross-networked, collaborative manner, because it's going to be big. And so we have to really figure out how to each bring what we can into the space and allow others to do their role.
Definitely. Who has the microphone? I see a question over there.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. I was very excited to hear you speaking about human rights as well. So I'm a medical doctor, and I wish to be a health advocate. And so I'm deeply concerned about climate change, obviously, but I want to make sure that I'm also applying a human rights lens. So I don't want to just promote electric cars by knowing that in the production of the batteries, there are human rights violations. So my question is, do you have an advice on how to make sure that I also include, when I think about health and climate change, I also don't forget human rights?
Great question. I think, and there's two parts of it. I think the human rights violations from climate change are becoming clearer and clearer. And if you go to climaterightsforall.com, you can see the declaration that came out of that meeting I mentioned that really outlines all of those in a very clear way as far as some of those connections. And I think for some countries it brings it into a completely different lens to start making those connections. I think they've been there a long time for people who've been working on human rights and indigenous peoples, but that connects together. I think on the responses, there are a whole set of false solutions that also have human rights implications. You mentioned one of on the electric cars. I think the best way to get your head around that is to look at Amnesty International's website. It's a really practical tip, because they are also getting much more involved, and I know we've been working with them a little bit on this exact problem of how you source. And so I think I think they're going to be doing more and more work on this that can then help you see that. But I just would always be asking, I think it's always ask the question, well, where is this coming from? How was it produced? And that'll get you far. But then if you want to look at specific areas, I think Amnesty and other human rights organizations can help and bring that expertise in.
I think we have several other hands up. I see one here in the front.
Hello, Caillou Orellana is my name. I'm from the organization HELP here from Germany. I have a question. In relation to actually some different topics, and you touched this like very at the beginning a little bit, is the divestment question. So what we as humanitarians with international mandate do is we transfer huge amounts of money all the time to different places. So I think that one strategy could also be that we actually consider a little bit more not who can transfer our money in the most, like in the cheapest way, but actually who is this and what are these people actually doing with the money they make out of the transfers or currency. I mean, Greenpeace is also involved a lot into currency management. Let's put it that way. I think this could be one strategy because these banks are going to invest the money again somewhere else where we maybe don't want the money to be invested, right? So, and this is one point that we could do.
Great idea. I think the exposing and looking at, and there's a lot of activity in the financial sector and banks these days. They're signing up to a lot of principles. Actually divesting from fossil fuels into sustainable, not so much yet. So I think those would be great questions to ask, both as organizationally, but also as individuals. Thanks.
You hear me? Yes, okay. So I'm a medical coordinator for MSF, and I'm also Brazilian. So these are very important questions in Brazil right now, especially with the extermination of indigenous people in the Amazon. But actually, my question is more operational. So one thing I wanted to ask is how we can avoid to be instrumentalized in the sense that developed nations can use, this is a common question in humanitarian action anyway, but developed nations and companies can use aid as a way of alleviating their responsibilities towards warming. And then the second question would be, as you mentioned Yemen, where the conflict has created the situation where the health situation has deteriorated. But as MSF, we do not protest or engage against the conflict itself. What we do is to make sure the warring parties follow rules of engagement that prevent damage to the civilian population. So my question would be, other than storytelling and making sure we advocate for the patients and making sure that we link their situation to climate change, I don't see what else could be the engagement an organization as MSF could have as far as advocacy in the climate change issue. So I would like to understand your views on that.
Go ahead, you go first.
I'll maybe have a look at that, at the second part of the question. I think you framed very nicely our role in this, and the debate has been very much raging with MSF about what piece of the puzzle we take. And I think I would orient us back to one of the key messages we're giving here is that we don't have to do this alone. So MSF, for ourselves, we can talk about what comes into the inpatient department or the mobile clinic in terms of health data. We can talk about what we see there. We can talk about, in terms of témoignage, we talk about what patients and communities and populations tell us. Are we the people that say this is linked to that? Maybe not necessarily, but if we work in a network of many other organizations that do have that expertise, then a shared experience of the environment will enable us to make those connections more efficiently. So it may not be up to MSF to necessarily do that or advocate for that. We tell patient stories, we talk about the situation on the ground. But if we work hand in hand with organizations that have that expertise and can make that connection, then it can be for them to do so. Does that make sense as an answer? Yeah.
Maybe building on that and then going back to your first question, which is a really important one. I mean, I guess, so and I don't know your kind of how you work, so bear with me for a minute because I'll just throw out some ideas, but you decide whether they're appropriate or not. But I can imagine that you would be in conversations about how to avoid conflict, right? I mean, I don't know if you look, so there is the storytelling about the impacts and connecting the dots to climate change, which I think would be hugely important. I just think I think for those of you who are here, it might come naturally, but I think for most people it doesn't. And the thing about climate change is it used to be seen as this far-off problem, but now it's not. It's very here and now. And helping people connect those dots and how you even talk about something that's going, that I think is very big, and I think that's a big deal, that if you were to do that. And I think it would make a big difference. The other thing I would think about is if you are in debates about, well, what caused this, or how do we avoid this in the future? Then bringing in the root causes of climate change as one of the factors, because obviously there's a whole bunch of factors which are at the root cause. I mean, poverty, inequities, the whole economic system that benefits some and not others, right? Those are the same root causes that are causing climate change in many cases, and human rights violations. So if you bring the causes of climate change into those conversations, and even say, you know, there is a way out of this, why not? And ask questions. Why not invest in renewable energy rather than this? Now, in Brazil right now, obviously, you know, raising questions about deforestation can endanger your life, literally. So everyone needs to find their way forward on this. But I think on the solution side, it's affordable, it's cheaper now than fossil fuel installations. And so bringing forth some of the solutions and connecting those dots and having your voices do that, I think would be very helpful. And again, lots of information out there with good examples that could be provided for you to kind of bring that story to life. And ask questions to the governments that are coming, which is a bit my answer to your first one. So I think, you know, the governments that are coming in and funding and providing aid, and this is tricky, I know, but they are the same governments that are not acting adequately on climate change, right? Like, all right, I have to do this. We're in Berlin. Let's look at Germany right now, right? There's just been a huge debate, 1.4 million kids and adults out on the streets. What does the government do? A super weak, ineffective package. That's not, you know, sorry, I get a little, no. But
we're humanitarians. We generally agree with this.
So, and they also give a lot of money for aid, right? Which is great. Germany's one of the countries that I think does that. But finding ways of working in the questions of, you know, actually, if you look over time, if you want to avoid having to have more and more and more demands on this aid, well, get your own house in order. And work in the Paris Agreement. I'm saying it in a way that I would say it, not you would say it. So that's, I think, one piece. And I think the other would be, I think oftentimes you know, look out for schemes. So I think the main way I see countries trying to avoid their responsibility either is by saying we're going to double our commitment. Chancellor just did this. We're going to double our commitment here on this funding. Meanwhile, we'll do a little bit over here. And so I think we can help. Let us know those. If we don't see them, we can call those out and stay on top of it. The other way is countries are trying to now go back to planting trees to offset emissions, and oftentimes that has negative impacts on local communities. And so I think being aware of those, and again, that's where we can divide and conquer. As activist organizations, we can take some of those on, and you can let us know some of those. But I think it's by calling it out, and it's keeping the pressure on. I mean, as much as you're able, and I just have to, as much as you're able to engage in debates about increasing the level of ambition on acting on climate change, however you can do that, that will help reduce the stresses that are going to come your way in the future, and we need your voices.
Hello, I'm Günther from Doctors of the World at the University of Munich. I'm here. I want to build on that a little bit, and I would like to have your ideas on a dilemma that I'm seeing, because what you have been describing now in your discourse is we have large disparities, we have inequity, we have populations in distress, and you yourself were using terms like there needs to be investment, improvement of systems. So it all comes with an ecological cost. And as we all know, the reflexes by politics, and we have seen that, is always, yes, we will invest and also get our industry on board to support populations that live in low and middle income countries, which in turn is again accelerating the output of greenhouse gases and of pollutants and so on. While at the same time, people will have a big problem to change their ways of life. So actually, what we are promoting here, and also now in this session that we are having here, is an acceleration of the problem that we are facing. So what are your ideas about this? I mean, we face this also in humanitarian action when we are trying to improve a health system, build a hospital, try to make sure that drugs are available. It all comes with ecological costs. Like just one example I would like to give, maybe one story. I was in the Central African Republic, and when people were asking me where is the hospital that the organization I was working with back then has built there, I was saying, just follow the density of garbage on the ground, because there were no plastic bags in that village before. And when you were following the density of plastic bagging on the ground and you hit the highest level of garbage, you were at the hospital, and that was the truth.
No, go for it.
Sorry
I saw
for
you
that.
bring your mic up. I'm like, okay.
We'll do the climate and humanitarian.
So I think there's different parts of your question. So I think one is about systems change. And one is about what we're each doing, right, in our own, well, personal and organizational lives. On the systems change piece, I mean, I think that's where we're actually quite united on a set of values that, you know, it's not about, it actually, there are underlying systemic problems that are exacerbating everything. Exacerbating inequality, exacerbating climate change, exacerbating human rights violations, exacerbating humanitarian crises. And that's where you get more into, I think, well, there's different, and it depends on the country where you are, but like who's making the decisions, who's funding elections, who's determining, well, if you look at kind of developing country export-based economies that are, their whole economy has been based on a colonialization of the past, of exporting goods, like palm oil goods into the West. And so I think there, and I haven't talked very much about kind of what are the types of policies and approaches and all of that that are needed, but I think it's not just about putting a price on carbon, right? It's actually about going much more into the root causes on the systems of the decision-making processes in various countries, the level of corruption that occurs in different countries, and going into different policies that are not only about climate change, but actually are about equality, health, et cetera, across the whole board. And I think that's where also the radical collaboration needs to occur. So for example, if there's something that is needed in a country that's more about the health infrastructure, I'm just, again, just giving an example, well, Greenpeace should be willing to swing in and say that is what's needed, even, or sign on to something that's there, even though it may not be what we're working on, but it's important to you, and so we're in a partnership in that we support on that, because I think some of these systems change things, they're huge, the interests behind them are very large. The other part of your question, I think, but I'm not, is because I think, you know, there's always this question that comes up is it capitalism that's the big problem? And I'm not sure if that's what you're trying to get at as well, yeah. And clearly, the current neoliberal economic system is a driver of all of these problems. And I think that it is fundamental that we look at, you know, we're not going to be able to topple capitalism all at once, but we look at some of the fundamental things that are in capitalism, the short-termism, the relation of corporations, their role in all of that, and start really addressing those, not only kind of the impacts of that system. And the other thing I think, which I'm not, is you know, our own individual actions. I know there's a big debate in a way about kind of, okay, how much do we as individuals or organizations fly? What do we, all of this, which I think is very important, and we should all work to fly less, if at all, if you can take the train. You can't take the train everywhere if you need to go. But my main message is what we need that, and we need people engaged in political processes. Like, we need, the things that are starting to shift are due to the fact that whether it be at a school board, whether it be at a health board meeting, whether it be at a church meeting, whether it be at a mosque, whether it be with your elected representative, people are raising these issues. And that's the other piece that I just feel is as, if not more important than the kind of individual footprint piece.
If I just could take an opportunity to grab on maybe to the last part, because what you said about your structuring car and following the trail of trash resonates, I think, with many of us. I know that there are many, many, many moments in my life where I've left behind huge structures made of plastic sheeting, where we've had to run massive emergency operations with fleets of 40 to 120 vehicles that are definitely not electric. You know, there's a footprint to that. Not all of it we can change overnight, but I think that institutionally and individually, we have a moral obligation at this point to at least have an assessment of what our footprint is. That's your baseline. Where are the problem areas? And then choosing what you can start tackling. Surprisingly, even though we don't talk about it that much, there are quite a few best practices already available within the humanitarian, arena. We've got studies published on fuel consumption and how much we usually use and what alternatives there might be. We've got studies on green energy to switch to more solar-powered options for ACs or refrigerators rather than always using generators. We do have, I mean, there's a lot of different options, and I think that's the point is we don't have the ability, each individual institution, to address all of this by ourselves. But collectively, we've already got quite a breadth of experience, and we can start sourcing and sharing these practices between us. But we have an obligation to know what our baseline is.
And maybe just thinking about your procurement policies. Yeah. My gosh, if you all were to come together and say, we need this and that and that, and in a more, quote, sustainable, I mean, would look at costs, et cetera, but that would be huge.
Carol might be able to speak a bit to that when she comes up later. There was actually an interview I saw with you which made me very worried, where you spoke about the pharmaceutical industry in India, which, at least for MSF, we depend very heavily on, and the production standards. So all of these things to be kept in mind, but again, let's take this step by step. Most important is that you know what your baseline is, and this next step is to choose how you go forwards and get good examples from others around you, and where you identify problem areas that are outside your remit, have open, frank discussions or more intense lobbying with your counterparts if it's in a supply chain.
Hello, hi, thank you. My name is Alexander, I'm a Swedish undergraduate student. I felt very interesting to listen to both of you. Myself, I have a little bit of a background in, well, not background, I'm more interested, I would rather say, in sustainability, so my focus will be on you, Jennifer. We've talked a lot, and based on what I know so far, is that climate change, amongst others, are mainly propelled forward by two categories, overconsumption and overpopulation. But I haven't talked about overpopulation at all today, so I would just wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on that. And on the same thing, if you, Caroline, can also talk a little bit on that factor as well, overpopulation in connection to bacteria which become more resistant towards penicillin, as more and more, let's call it not aid camps specifically, but also cities have a pretty low, not pretty low, but their hygiene level might not be as high, which propel a more faster mutation level. So if you could just talk a little bit about overpopulation, I'll be very happy. Thank you.
Sure. So I think
Small subject,
exactly. And a good one to bring into the room and ask. And I think climate change is caused by the burning of fossil fuels and also the cutting of forests and deforestation. And clearly, consumption levels are a major driver of all of that. So, and it's done more by those in the wealthier spectrum of societies rather than in the poorer spectrums of society. So I think on the population question, I guess there's you know, this is me speaking and looking across this. I think obviously the number of people on Earth and the way that they consume, and this is the thing that is to me the key, right, is not sustainable. We need 4 planet Earths, right, if we're going to keep going the way that we're going with the population, with the consumption levels. The thing that I think is very important, though, is to look at the difference between the consumption levels of an individual in the United States versus in Europe, versus in Africa, versus in India, et cetera. And so you get in the climate sphere into a discussion more about equity and per capita emissions than on the population side. Clearly, and you know, if you look at countries that have had population controls in them, it's not necessarily meant a reduction in emissions. So my focus has been more, honestly, on trying to reduce the footprint of those with a very high footprint, rather than trying to reduce population levels, especially in countries where their per capita emissions are low anyway, and they probably need more people because all their kids don't survive, right? And so I think it's really important in the population discussion to bring that nuance. It's not a nuance, it's facts in. Because otherwise I think there can be a blame game that goes into countries that have large populations, that their population is the problem. For me, it's not their population, it's actually the consumption level that's there. And so it's, indeed, you could talk for a long time about it, and I'm happy to hear more thoughts in the coffee break. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would like to just state before I answer this question, to the best of my ability, is that I'm not an infectious disease specialist, so perhaps the question, which I understood, is essentially overpopulation, urban environments, and the link to increasing rates of antimicrobial or antibiotic resistance, correct? Okay. So what I can say just practically is that obviously for humanitarian organizations, we have already, but we maybe haven't mentally switched from the 1970s rural hospital setup to what is now, as we spoke about earlier, a population that's going to be majority urbanized, and how we work in urban settings. One of the things that we struggle with the most is doing these health assessments in urban settings, because we have a wide variety of yes, government-sponsored infrastructure and private structures, but then we have a wide variety of informal structures, street vendors of pills, et cetera, and it's very difficult to control, monitor, and figure out what's going on. And most importantly, it's almost impossible to follow the patient pathway from one to the other, because they'll tend to switch practitioners if they don't like the diagnosis given, or the fact that if the doctor says, well, actually, you don't need antibiotics for this. So those are concerns. There are some good publications that have come out about this in the Lancet, and also some that link rising ABR and climate change. But I don't know that I can specifically speak to the solution.
Yeah. Just one. This is way beyond my expertise. But the thing that I have learned also, and just to talk a little bit about it, is what it will look like when we have more distributed solar power around the world. Because Christiana Figueres, you might know, is writing former head of the Climate Convention. She's been writing a book and looking at, actually, what does the world look like when you're powered with renewable energy? And she recently was just talking to me about what it means out in the field for hospitals, for refrigeration, et cetera. And so that's also, just thinking of my Brazilian colleague's question as well, depending on where you are, that's the kind of solution that you need for your own work, but also is one that, in order to be able to have that, you need the government to be able to shift as well. And I think that we often think, gosh, where we're going to, away from fossil fuels into renewables, is going to be so hard. Actually, it's going to be quite good for a whole bunch of people.
True. We've had a concentration of questions from the middle of the audience. Maybe some chance to ask questions from the two corners. And Nora, please feel free to give me a wave when we need to be. Oh, is there a hand over there?
Hello.
Okay, but afterwards we have to share the microphone backwards.
Okay. Thanks for your wonderful presentations. Noelia from Argentina. I know this is what we are discussing now about the effects, the impacts of climate change in humanitarian crisis. I would like to know, in your experience, if you can name some examples of practical cases where you have seen that the analysis of climate change was included in the previous analysis and then in the response, as like successful examples. Thanks a lot.
Successful examples where the analysis came in, where the analysis of climate came in.
Around humanitarian crisis.
We can think of any crisis there.
So specific examples of where the climate impacts came into a humanitarian crisis and it was successfully. Good question. Because I mean, the Sudan is one that's often mentioned, but I don't know if it was successful. I think, we try and be quite cautious also about, climate change being the straw that can break the camel's back, not the main cause of these things. And so I need to think more. You might have better examples.
Well, this is going to sound very depressing. No, so I will say what my experience has been is if it is there, if the analysis is there, we tend to have a lot of meetings around it. Everybody puts in their part. There's an analysis of the risks and vulnerabilities and how we should prepare better for the next time round. The obvious example would be the Horn of Africa. And then the next time round comes and we all get caught unawares again, despite knowing all of this and despite having done that work, because we didn't look at our own modus operandi and how we could adjust it to the analysis. So I've seen the analysis happen, and I've seen it be championed by actors and by governments, but we have to make the connect between the analysis and how we adapt our own operations. So if that means, so one of the things, my colleagues in MSF have had enough of hearing this story, but I worked for a long time in DRC and in Burundi, which are areas that know malaria very, very well. With changing climate, the vector, the mosquito, is climbing into areas that are of higher altitude that previously did not have the same burden of malaria, and we're having an increased the vulnerability of these individuals is increased. And for me, it is problematic to return over and over and over again to do the same responses in the same areas, seeing these same shifts that the population can tell you about, quite frankly, and not tailoring our operations a little bit more to that, thinking forwards a bit. Last question?
Yes,
okay.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Tobias from Plan International.
Sorry, I can't see you. Can you wave?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. I'd like to share one experience from the field in a project of climate change adaptation, where we have experienced that while it was fairly successful to trigger activism and promote youth activists, especially in becoming supportive of climate change adaptation, disaster prevention, as well as environmental degradation activism. When we saw the evaluation, it became clear that the concepts are getting blurred. So it's kind of a wild activism that is triggered, and then plastic waste reduction and choosing different crops to be more resilient, as well as disaster prevention, all gets blurred, and it's not attached to the concepts behind it. And I was asking myself, when seeing this result of the evaluation, is this important at all? I have the feeling it is important that there is a clear theoretical background that is, easily to be conveyed also to our target groups when working in the field, but still the activism is good. So it would be great to hear your opinion on that. Thanks.
Good question.
Well, I think it'll probably vary situation by situation, and I think that so it is good to have. I mean, I think it's needed to have not just the theory, but the science, right? That's there that will give a sense, and that's what I would try and start doing. Is like wherever you're working, get together with different practitioners and look at okay, what could likely come, and then think in advance. This is what we all should be, spend that time for the long-term strategic, but actually it's really important in advance of what the different adaptation responses could be, right? So that then you've already answered the questions before the event happens. But I also think that on adaptation, oftentimes the responses are things that just make good sense. And that's true whether it might be in humanitarian, it's true in nature conservation, so adaptation, having protected areas of forests, having protected areas of oceans, which are good for all the reasons of the resiliency of that ecosystem. You need it even more because of climate change. And so thinking about what you're doing in order to get ready for whatever crisis will hopefully not, but could come, and then just putting that climate lens on it, I think would be good. But if you don't have, I don't know, it really depends on the situation. But I do think there's lots of interlinkages that are there that are things that you would be doing anyway, but need to be done even more because of the intensity of what's ever going to come your way.
I particularly appreciate that question because I know that we've been struggling with it internally. I have asked colleagues who have made their life's work climate change and science if there is some sort of Venn diagram out there that essentially practically tells me environmental degradation means these things, climate change means these things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't exactly exist. So what I would just say is that, of course, all positive action is positive. But we have to keep in mind what we can and can't do. If we engage in environmental degradation and we want to go do an assessment of the pollutants in a certain area affecting people that are coming into our health structure, then we shouldn't assume that just because we are engaged in that arena that we're toxicologists, so to speak. So I guess I would keep in mind that we have to be conscious of the definitions and where the limits are in order to know when to ask for help and bring in external expertise. Does that make sense? All right. I'm being told that it's time to wrap up. I thank everybody very much for their participation, and particularly Jennifer for being here with us.
Well, thank you. I learned a huge amount.